How do I possibly follow an intro like that? Good morning, it is lovely to see you. Thank you for having me. I've been a youth worker for just over 15 years. And in that time, I've learned that churches have a word, a technical term, an almost secret word that they use to sum up what they want from their young people's work. It's a word that expresses the breadth and the depth, the hopes and the dreams, the strategic aspirations of what they want their youth work to look like. However, it's not a word you'll hear spoken at interviews. You won't see it written in person specs or contracts. You won't hear it in discussion at general synod or strategic forums. It's a word that's whispered in the corridors of PCC meetings or spoken by the vicar in an unguarded moment. And that word, that technical word that summarizes what we want from our youth work in church is the word something. We need something for the youth. We want something for the teenagers. Could someone, anyone, please do something, anything with the young people? And I believe that this relentless drive for something has left us a little woolly around the edges. And I believe that both youth work and the wider church have suffered as a result. Because something doesn't really require much of anything. Something doesn't require our youth leaders to have rich theological understanding. Something doesn't require skills in duty of care or leading teams or conflict resolution. Something doesn't look for integration of young people into the wider church. Something doesn't think about long-term growth pathways, rites of passage, or giving young people a resilient ownership of their own faith. Something doesn't actually require a young people's worker to really stick around that long. It doesn't require much of anything. Not that there aren't youth ministries that blow these expectations out of the water, but I think broadly, our standards for youth work are just too low. Now, this might explain why the vast majority of Christian youth workers in the UK have absolutely no formal training whatsoever, and why every year more Bible colleges drop youth work from its curriculums. It might explain why the curriculums for ordained ministry rarely includes a module on young people's work. I mean, pastors and vicars in the room, I wonder how many of you were required to learn anything about youth work when you trained to be a minister. And is that because the expectation was someone else would do it? As if young people were not part of the church you'd be responsible for. I used to work for a large church in South London, and in the 4 years I was there, we had youth and children's work in a building next door, and neither the vicar or the curate visited in those 4 years. It's a common story. That said, there's another side of this. If you look at the self-reported statistics from denominations in the UK from the last 10 to 15 years, you'll discover, you can work out, that only 1 in 4 churches are doing any intentional work with young people. 1 in 4. That would mean that 75%, the majority, most churches in the UK are not intentionally reaching out to people under the age of 18, which is bonkers, which would be the last technical term I used to say. According to the Barna Group, 94% of people become a Christian before they turn 18, which means there's only a 6% chance after that, if you haven't by then. The International Bible Society say 83% of Christians become so between the ages of 4 and 14, that 10-year window, the something window. And even if those numbers are out, 10%, 20%, it would still be the largest missional opportunity we have in the UK. But 3 out of 4 churches are not doing something. There are over 12 million young people in the UK, and only 25% churches are doing something. So I guess you can kind of understand why we just want something. Better is something of anything than nothing of nothing, right? But in 70 years of doing youth work the way that we do it today, I believe something just isn't enough. There is a solution though, isn't there? Instead of searching relentlessly just for something for young people, we should be looking for something more. I've spent a lot of my last decade studying and writing about the biblical theology and the history of youth work. And I've been thinking, what can we do to restore a biblical approach to youth work that raises standards and raises expectations? And there's a lot to say, but I think it comes down to one simple truth. Bodies do much better when they're in one piece. Bodies do much better when they're in one piece. I'm going to ask a pedantic question. If I was to saw off your legs, I won't, I'm a nice guy. But if I was to saw off your legs and place them in a box 12 feet away from you, are you or your legs going to be particularly happy about it? What about in 10 years' time? Will it get better? Will they grow back? What if you were to duct tape them back on? Bodies are designed beautifully and perfectly to work as one holistic unit, distinct parts, but one system. And staying with that gruesome theme, I'm a youth worker, I get away with this. If I was to cut off your hands and place it on the table, it will actually move for a while. It will twitch, it will exhibit what looks like signs of life. And a severed hand can survive for up to 12 hours in a warm environment, or up to a week if properly refrigerated. That's the thing I should tell your children. Let's be honest though, that hand is not really alive. A twitch is not voluntary movement. For all intents and purposes, when it's removed from the body, it becomes a dead limb. Is that where something has left us? My late Uncle Bob was awesome. I loved Uncle Bob. I always thought Uncle Bob was a real life pirate. He even had a hook for a hand. In reality, he served in the British Navy in the Falklands War, and in an explosion, he had an injury and had to have his arm amputated. And when I was a child, I asked him, relatively innocently, Uncle Bob, what did you do with the severed arm? Is it in a big glass jar somewhere? To which he responded, binned it. Didn't work anymore. My Uncle Bob knew it, and so do we. Our bodies do much better when they're in one piece. And this goes to any limb that we hack off the body and put into its own contained ecosystem. Glass jars just don't work. And this raises the question, just how many limbs can be removed from the body, and for how long before the body itself becomes just another dead limb? The more we chop the church into smaller and more specific groups, the more the whole body suffers. Whether knowingly or not, I think we use something like a cellular model for church growth. If you divide a cell, that cell will produce more cells. And the thought is, if we divide the church into smaller, more homogeneous, more missionally contained, more targeted groups, then we will see numerical growth. There are two problems with this. First, it doesn't work. Since it was first introduced during the church growth movement in the 1950s, they've played around with an idea called the homogeneous unit principle. It just hasn't worked. In youth work or in anywhere else, we just haven't seen the missional long-term growth that we were promised. And second, it doesn't jive with any of the biblical metaphors for relationship. The Bible uses marriage, family, things that suffer when you cut them up. And these separated limbs, they become crazy resource heavy and ultimately always unsustainable, leaving burned out youth workers and pastors in their wake. And whether it's after months or decades, the damage always shows. And I think we are seeing that damage today in the youth work and in the church. A youth group that is essentially separate to the life of a church is effectively a limb in a big glass jar. And this contained ecosystem can never be as healthy as it could be if it was properly connected from the body it came from. Even a large youth group, well, it looks great, but is essentially disconnected from the wider people of God, will always be denying something foundational to both the youth group and the church. And give this a few decades, and you see the overall health of both groups evaporate across the church. And I think this is exactly what we've been seeing since the late 1940s. What do you think? What do you think? Have we done this? Have we institutionalized an amputation? Have we inadvertently organized a split or a schism right down the middle of church? Have we divided church up into main church and youth work? Because if we have normalized a situation that will negatively affect the health of both. And it's not that both of them have specific needs. Of course they do. Of course, they can have their own groups, their own projects. The question is, the assumption that we begin with, do we start from the whole and then build specific ministry for each part? Or do we start in reality from a place of separation in the hope we can take them back together later? Youth work can't just impose itself onto what church is. And churches can't just add a few more intergenerational or all-age projects to fix this. A bigger, more joined-up conversation needs to happen. I think if you were to ask 10 youth workers what's wrong with church, 9 of them are going to say it's not youth-friendly, right? And they'd be right. If you develop a church culture with a significant people group missing, it will always be somewhat incompatible with that group. But if you were to ask 10 pastors what's wrong with youth work, they'll say, well, young people drop off before they come to church. Now, it's begging the question, but it's still true. The low expectations we have in youth work means it hasn't tended to properly prepare young people for a life of faith. I think it's one of the reasons why biblical literacy is so low, why dropout rates at 14 and 18 are so high. And we used to talk about the 20s to 30s gap, then it became the 20s to 40s gap, and now we're talking about the 20s to 50s gap. Neither youth work nor main church can fix this, but there is hope if we begin with a new assumption. We don't need something for the young people, but young people need something. They need to know Jesus, which should flow naturally and intentionally from a greater relationship with what church is meant to be. We need church for young people. Not their own church, but the church, the living, breathing body of Christ, whole, united together, moving and striving as one, with young people themselves seen as integral to it, not just training for it later. We're not just keeping church warm for young people for when they grow into it. They need it and we need them. Church cannot truly be church without young people, which should make us ask significant theological questions about the 75% that don't intentionally reach out to them. Youth work can't fix this. A gaping hole doesn't fill itself. A severed limb can't crawl across the floor like Stanley and reassert itself into the body. We need to bring youth work back into true coherence with the church. The church is on the operating table. The only hope we have is to make a whole again. Thank you very much. Yep, sorry, I was watching my time. I'm very happy to answer questions.
You did very well. We've got a question online from Richard. Bible colleges have dropped their youth worker training programs, he says, because there was little student demand for them.
Yeah.
To avoid institutional amputation and to be the one body that you advocate, isn't it better to use voluntary youth leaders from among the church's own membership rather than paid professional youth workers?
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's worth saying that there is less than 1,000 full-time youth workers in the UK right now, and I think less than 100 in training. And something like 70 to 80% of youth work in the UK is run by volunteers already. It's run by lay workers. And I'm a huge fan of lay work in youth ministry. I think it is something we want to celebrate, but it still needs training, it still needs undergirding, and it still needs professionals to facilitate that. I think the problem hasn't been that professionals are doing all the youth work. It's that when a professional is in post, they take over all the youth work and then they don't last very long when they burn out. I think if we can retrain our professional youth workers to be facilitators, then we can marshal the lay ministry a lot more effectively.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Oh, sure.
Could you just ask the impact of the COVID pandemic on young people's engagement with church? So just over this last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, of course. I'll be brief because it's a big question. Thank you. I think what COVID did is reveal to a lot of the church, not what happens when we're unprepared, but what was going to happen in the next 5, 10 years anyway. I think it sped up a lot of processes, and that happened in young people's work. And I think what we've seen in young people's work is young people who felt a huge culture of fear from the adults and culture and media around them, and that fear was unanswered largely by ministry. And we saw young people who, even though they are social media natives, they're digital natives, using that phrase, not all of their heart, all of their soul engages online. And so I think there was a significant disconnect between effective young people's mission and discipleship over COVID, even when we were doing good digital work. I think what's been left over is still a culture of fear, which adults, the church needs to answer. And a whole bunch of young people who, even if they connected online, only partially connected online, and we haven't really met their needs yet. It's a longer conversation. I will point to a Growth book at youth ministry on, is it called youth ministry? I wrote this, youth ministry online, which is actually written by a number of youth workers who looked at how do we engage young people online during COVID. Thank you.
Colin,
when your group is writing booklets, are you driven by saying, well, what talent have we got here that we should be putting into the pipeline, or use it the other way around and say what need is out there for which we can orientate our writing? I'm aware of this myself in our group, and I just need to know how much that dilemma is with you.
Yeah, Colin, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you, by the way. Thank you. I think it's a bold balance. I think because we haven't had a huge uptake of lots and lots of budding authors. So I think it's a case of what the people bring, and they often will open our eyes to an issue we didn't even realise was there. But also we're looking actively for titles that meet the specific needs that the board and people are telling us are needs in youth work. There's a bit of a bold balance. We're looking for what comes to us, but we're also actively seeking people who can speak intelligently and passionately on those issues. Thank you.